Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the one television show for business, by business, about business. For some time, I've been concerned about how our media treats communications in general, how we get communications, and what it means for people trying to advertise and sell their products. At the same time, whenever you open the newspaper and you see descriptions of New Zealand's future, somewhere in there is innovation. Those two topics, communication and innovation, come together today on our show. Many of you will have seen the wonderful television series Mad Men. Well, we've got one of the early members of that era with us. For as long as anyone can remember, Mike Hutcheson has stood astride of both communications and innovation. And I have with me today the one and only Mike Hutcheson. Welcome, Mike. Now, Mike, we should start at the beginning. It wasn't always in the advertising business, but it was somewhere in the South Island. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it was. Well, I grew up in the South Island. I grew up in.
You never have grown up.
I never have grown up. No, I'm Peter Pan on whiskey.
Yeah.
I grew up in Nelson, and the funny thing was, I went into advertising not having any idea that there was such a business, and that's actually the origins of my career, A, in advertising and B, in innovation. I actually I studied fine arts at school, and thinking I was going to have to be an art teacher, because I've got no employable skills whatsoever apart from being able to write and draw.
Okay.
And I did fine arts prelim in my 7th form, or year 13 at school. And I got into Ireland, and in the last week of school, the form master got me inside and said, "Now, Hutcheson, it's about your marks, they're ridiculously high. If we put these forward, we'll have to give you first place in class. We can't do that because you've just done art." And in fact, I'd done art in English, and that's what you did in prelim.
So you came into the advertising was from the artistic side.
Yeah.
So you're the creative guy.
Yep.
Did you go to Ireland in the end?
No, I didn't, because having been told I couldn't have first place in class, I got the pip.
Oh, not surprising.
And my father was a school teacher, and I must admit I was kind of nervous about going into pedagogy of any kind, being an impecunious school teacher for the rest of my life. I didn't, in fact, that's a story in itself, because not only did I do fine arts, but I also did English. I actually came from the school in English. I mean, I could write too, so that was kind of my mainstay, if you like, and because my father had been an English and French teacher. I actually hit the jackpot because he'd just graduated from university when war was declared, and because he had a master's in English and French, and because he had a degree, he was sent straight to Sandhurst. So he came back from the war as a military officer, but also a school teacher. So I couldn't be late. And he was my headmaster as well, which didn't actually help at all.
So you grew up in a studious household.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
And so you saw people being studious and learning. And that must have stayed with you for the rest of your life, hasn't it?
Well, it has, yeah. Well, and in fact, because we lived at the school, my father was the headmaster of a private prep school, and holidays for me were in the school all by myself, and I spent most of my time in the library, and so I would just sit. I just devour books, particularly historical novels, Roman history, Greek history, Norse history. Arthurian legends. I mean, to me, stories were everything. So I read.
Of course, there's a great foundation for any kind of creativity. And so where did you start in the advertising business?
Well, and that was an accident, because I got the pip and decided I was going to go to Ireland. I enrolled in law school. And
yes, you do.
Yes, you do. Well, mostly because it was funny. We had a guy from the University of Canterbury came up to Nelson. It was a Nelson College. And our entire career guidance came from this bloke standing in the assembly. There would have been, I guess, 20 or 30 of us who were all heading off to uni. He said, "Okay, all you chaps doing law over here, medicine over here, accounting here, and teaching there." And that was
the guidance.
That was the guidance. And I thought at that time I could only be a school teacher, and I had been admitted into Ireland with fine arts prelim, so I sat with the rest of the guys who were doing teaching, because I thought that was the only path for me. And he came, and there were probably 5 or 6 of us, and he said, "Look, it's wonderful that you young chaps have chosen teaching as a career, because it's actually not a career, it's actually a vocation, it's a calling. And I'm very proud of you for realising that you want to give back to society. But you do have to understand that you probably never own a Jag." And he said, "Any questions?" I said, "Where do the guys who want to own Jags go?" So,
they're over here.
So he said, "I think you need to be with the lawyers." So I did. That was literally it. So I went and enrolled, and doing a
Did the Jag ever materialise?
Well, it did, and I thought it was a crap when I finally got one. But anyway, but by the way, so I enrolled at law school, and I didn't realise how boring law could be. And I realised that in retrospect, that law is about precedent and research, and it's managing other people's findings rather than originating your own.
Yeah.
And after a couple of years, I was sick of it. I went and had a very wise old uncle, my mother's brother, who was actually then head of correspondence schools. And I went to see him and said, look, I'm just stuck. I just don't want to do law anymore. It's boring. And he said, what can you do? I said, well, the only two things I can do are write and draw. And he said, well, why don't you think about advertising? I said, what's advertising? And I came from Nelson. I mean, there were and I knew there were ads on TV, but it never occurred to me that there were people who actually did them. You know, I guess they just turned up in the TV channels and the studios somehow. And then I found this business that was, I think, made for me. And yeah.
Well, of course, advertising is the sort of creative backside of business communications. Would you like to describe what the process of producing good creative communication is?
It's probably actually about asking the right questions and looking at things differently. And in that sense, nothing has changed. I believe that the foundations of all good ideas are inside our own brains. Now that I'm teaching, my role now is as an adjunct professor at AUT. I teach innovation.
Very good. Turn full circle. Your dad would be proud of you.
And I never thought I would. I'm a kind of an accidental academic, and I'll come back to that because. But I think that what I get the students to do now is do what I call it for a Wikipedia for me. I ask them because when they come into a class or they come into a group, and usually a cohort of 15 to 20 people, and you know they've got brown hair, blue eyes, or black hair, brown eyes. What does it? That's all you know. You know their names and that they're enrolled in your class. I say there's nothing more I know about them. I get them to do a brainberg. What you see above the water is the physical appearance, the names. What you don't see is attitude, aptitudes, and the stuff that they might be interested in, ancient hand ceramics or clarinetists, or they might be great kazoo players. And I get them to do what I call the brainberg, and then break it down into their own. For example, for you, you'd put in the things that you're interested in, from politics, religion, philosophy, architecture, whatever, history, geography, and so on. And under each of those headings, the things that you could sustain a dinner party conversation on. You don't necessarily need to be an expert, but you'd be curious enough to talk to somebody about that and enlarge your learning. And I believe this is the origins of creativity. You're absorbing lots and lots of information and then connecting dots.
Well, let's circle back to advertising. So some of the great ad campaigns we remember, the wonderful Toyota ads, I mean, you might even have something to do with that, with, what was his name?
Barry Crump.
Yeah, and then also the Crunchy Bar ads. I mean, we all look back in time, some of these things you remember as your childhood. The process that got them finally to somebody to invest a lot of money in, what was made them different from other things? Because in the end, when I look at television now, most of it, the advertising seems to be display advertising. It's rare that we see those true stories being told in advertising.
Well, that was the interesting thing, because when we, I was one of the founders of Colenso and during the 70s, we kind of explored that notion of telling stories rather than product and price. Yeah. Because initially, when television arrived in this country, it was radio with pictures. And in fact, Gilbert Stringer, who was then the head of NZBC TV, said it's just radio with pictures. Yeah. And of course, we realised it's not. It's actually about storytelling, because the early TV commercials were, buy Brillo soap. It was just someone smiling into the camera with a pack shot being shown. And we, in those early days of Colenso, thought, no, let's tell a story around it. And so we built, like the Crunchy Bar commercial, which Roger McDonnell wrote. I mean, and that
was a Silver Screens one, if I recall.
It was. And Tony Williams. And basically, they clipped together. They got the rights for a whole lot of movie footage and just panel beated a whole lot of different images together to make it extravaganza. And that commercial ran for 40 years.
Life's a whole long journey, boys, before you grow too old. Don't miss the opportunity to strike a little gold. Out west, folks are fussing you. The way to make him stop is to quit control your Crunchy Bar and fill him full of chop. Have a crunchy, pokey bar. Golden crunchy, pokey bar. Take it away.
I knew it was a long time. It was a long time.
Yeah, 40 years. And it was And one of the interesting things is one of the characters, was a friend of mine who died. I mean, every time I see it now, it's tinged with nostalgia.
But if I recall, the purpose of those was to have a mental anchor into a story that produced an emotional response in the individual to maybe like the product.
Yeah.
Well, where do we get that today?
Well, we do, in a sense, on YouTube, but the trouble is we don't get those big extravaganzas that reached everybody. Audiences now are minimised rather than maximised.
But, we've got influencers now, which sort of... to what extent has that got any integrity, really? Any less than perhaps the storytelling that we saw in the early stages of advertising?
Well, I think now the big brands are kind of still there, but people have become immune to brand stories the way that mosquitoes become immune to DDT.
Really?
Yeah. Over time, they need to be engaged, and I think humour is a great way to engage people, for example, and it needs to have integrity to actually work. There are some influencers who do have integrity. They're not just paid to do it, and the millennials today spot that. It's really quite interesting. They'll know in a flash whether it's worth following or not. One of the problems is that we have become, not so much in New Zealand, but certainly globally in the States and in Europe, spectators rather than players. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, in this country, some of the best advertising in the world comes from New Zealand.
Still?
Yep. Certainly has done in the past, and I think that Kiwis abroad now do some of the best.
But a lot of money is spent internationally on getting endorsements from celebrities and particularly big-time sports people.
Yep.
Is that running out of puff?
No, it seems to be growing because I think as the world population grows, we hang on even in politics. Yeah. We are now in the age of celebrity politicians.
Indeed, yeah.
Globally, the Boris Johnsons, the Yeltsins, the
photogenic, charismatic.
So that I think all those Trump, like him or hate him, he's a character, and I think people. Almost going back to that Hitlerian time, where in a world of confusion, weak people look for strong leaders. And I don't mean I mean weak-brained people look for strong leaders because they think they need to know a direction, and I think that's quite sad. Interestingly enough, though, and if I can circle back to my own thesis, which I did some years ago on the alchemy of creativity in New Zealand business. And I ended up in my advertising career as CEO at Saatchi's here. And one of the things that made me really curious was why don't our clients recognise our genius and do what we say? And I got a psychologist to come and spend a week in the agency and watch how we behave and try and explain to us what do we need to do to convince our clients that this is the way to go. And she said, well, they think you're Fruit Loops for a start. I mean, you guys are talking Swahili, they're talking French. There's no point in chatting about it in Swahili in order to be understood. And so we learned a little process, and I call it the Moses principle. Moses didn't whip around behind a tent in the land of Canaan and write I got a few rules in the back of an envelope here, guys. He went away for 40 days and 40 nights and came back from Mount Sinai with tablets carved in stone in a thunderstorm, if you believe Talmud. I mean, and people respect theatre. They don't respect scribbles. One of the things that she pointed out to us was that we as individuals at Saatchi's, or certainly all the senior team when we went through Myers-Briggs, were all on the intuitive side of the ledger, except for the CFO.
As
you'd expect. So most of us were right brain, most of our clients, even if as individuals they may have been intuitive, their corporate cultures
have been beaten out of them by the requirements of the money men.
And our major clients then were Telecom and Lion, very rigid public companies having to report quarterly, annual reports. Don't take risks, pay the shareholders, short-term thinking, no big investment, long-term in innovation.
But then if you look at some of the huge breakthroughs in ads and communication, you think of that Super Bowl ad that Steve Jobs did at Apple. The rest of the company had all sorts of issues, but I mean everyone remembers it and everyone still quotes it. At the time I know that the shareholders went nuts because it cost $1 million or something. Today you think, well, that was money well spent. We don't sort of see that breakthrough stuff happening much anymore, do we?
Well, that's the point, because you're asking creative people to sell ideas to non-creative people. And we'll say what you're really, and because you're asking them to see the future. The future is by definition imaginary. How can someone without any imagination imagine the future? It's stupid. I mean, so we're asking accountants to imagine. Accountants are like sea captains. They know their wake. They don't know what's ahead.
Yeah.
You cannot chart your course by your wake.
Yeah.
Well, you can, but it's kind of dangerous.
Eventually it runs something.
Yeah. So what we need is people who've got over-the-horizon radar and can see things. And that's the point. And that was our life in advertising, because you an intuitive person will just get it. But then in order to sell it to a non-intuitive person, have to put a process in behind it. Backfill the strategy behind the idea.
So you're suggesting the ideas often came from left field somewhere.
Yep. And
the strategy that sat behind it really had to justify the money that was going in.
That's it. And that was our whole modus.
Yeah.
Once we realised that was the way to do it. Because if you're talking to a right brain person, they'll think, okay, let's sit down and brainstorm an idea. You can't do that. It doesn't work like that. Because let's hope that we do some research, some planning, some structure, and hope an idea, it's like, feed all these things and crank the handle and an idea will come up. Bullshit. It doesn't. You've got to have the idea first and then backfill it.
So, the cliche from Mad Men where suddenly the big idea appears, that's really what happens.
It's exactly what happens.
Yeah. The big idea.
Yeah. And that in itself can be fortuitous, but you have to have some kind of process. And that's kind of where I've got to now. And my whole thesis at uni was really about understanding what is the alchemy of creativity in New Zealand business. Because the interesting thing is that by almost all the international indices, New Zealand is in the top 10 in the world in terms of innovation and creativity. For example, and the last stats I put into my thesis, which is probably 4 years old now, but it's still pretty current, we were 6th in the world at authoring high-tech research reports.
Really?
But we're 63rd in the world behind Senegal and Bulgaria about high-tech manufactured output. The insight to me is that our most valuable export...
We should play it to that strength.
Yeah, we should. But our most valuable export is smart kids. It isn't primary produce, it's what we do with it.
Would you agree, I've always felt that one of the people, often I've travelled, so why are New Zealand so creative? Because you see it in our arts, for instance, and in music and so on. So, well, it's the way we grew up.
Yes.
The place we live, the colours and the bright flavours and the food, the whole environment tends to be one that tends to stimulate the senses.
Yep, and it's all those things I was talking about, the Wikipedia. If you took all the stuff that's in your brain and you put it in a chart, in the brain burger, in the Wikipedia, then you join those dots, because I believe the seeds of all our creativity is already in our heads. But what we do, and our secret sauce as Kiwis, is that we have the courage to do it. I mean, I grew up in Nelson, right, and I used to run around Trafalgar Park. And I remember having a chat with Rod Dixon, because Rod grew up in Nelson too, and we were talking. In fact, I think I've still got the Nelson provincial record for 75 yards Colts, because they changed it 2 years later. I never ran it again. But see, Kiwi gets to do that. Yeah. Well, we've all probably got a record or something. Success, even at a young level, is not a stranger to us.
Well, you can see it.
We've all got something. We've all been good at something, because that's just the way we are. And it's not hard to win the 75 yards Colts in Nelson. There's only about 6 guys turn up, but that doesn't matter. And I said to Rod, how come there's buggers like you there, win New York marathons and Olympic medals? And I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was, we just think we can. And I suddenly thought, that's a huge insight, because, okay, you're in Nelson, you run around Trafalgar Park, and you win the provincial champs.
Yeah. So you feel good?
And you're good, and that's good. So you go to the Nationals. You win the Nationals, and you think, I know, I'll go to the Worlds. There's only 3 hurdles for us between us and international fame in almost anything you do.
Where in the US you go to the city, the state, the county, you find your way through.
There are 110 hurdles. And the hurdles are no higher, because the time to beat is still the time to beat. But they just recede into the distance. Even if you can find the ground to run on, the chance of running all the championships you need to run. And I was thinking that the World Cup cricket, looking at India play, there's 11 players representing 1.4 billion people, whatever it is.
We've got 11.
We're 4.5. That tells me you've got a 400 times greater chance
of getting into
a representing country here.
That math, I think, is lost on a lot of people in New Zealand, but it's actually worth remembering.
I feel like one of the Blues Brothers now. I'm on a mission from God to teach our kids to be innovative rather than speculative. I'm a total fan of Bernard Hickey and his dictum that we won't grow our wealth as a nation by selling over highest houses to each other. So I think that to me is at the centre of it. We are naturally innovative, and I think we're naturally innovative because we think we can.
Well, let's hang on, slow down a bit. Can we define the term? What does innovation mean, or being innovative mean?
Okay, innovation to me is the love child of creativity and human need.
Okay, let's unpick that a little bit.
Okay, well, I mean, for example, the definition of creativity, it has to have three elements. Creativity has to be original, and it doesn't have to be like perfectly original. I mean, take that. I mean, Steve Jobs didn't invent any of that. Didn't invent the
put it all together.
He put it all together. That's innovation.
But he saw the opportunity.
Yeah, but because if you remember at the time, it was early 2000s when this came out, Motorola and Nokia, we were going to be talking into our wrists. They were going to go smaller, and he just said, "No, bugger that. There's a better idea here." Now that's innovation, and innovation can be it could be in cuisine. It doesn't need to be in technology. And the interesting thing now, a lot of the students who come into to my class, they default to tech. Tech's not the future. I mean, if one more student comes into me and says, "Look, I've got this brilliant app," I tell them to bugger off. Think about what's the problem you're solving. Now, the app may be part of that solution, but you think, what human problem are you solving? So to me, that's the need, and you look at the need and looking at it in a different way.
But can you apply process to this, or is it something that's just going to happen?
The insight, the inspiration happens. Sometimes it happens in a Paul to Damascus, epiphany. Sometimes it just drifts quietly out of the mist over time.
The cousin of all this is, and I know that the university's got courses in entrepreneurship, and I've got a problem with this. I thought entrepreneurship is something that you're just kind of born with. It sort of appears. You feel the sense of calling that you want to start a business or do something. And can you really teach that? I know you can teach innovation.
No, you can't. Yeah. I must admit, I'm cross swords with people in the business school about that, because I don't believe you can teach entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, okay,
Yeah. You can't. In fact, I upset some of the academics by saying it's like the Kama Sutra. You can read about it, and then you've got to do it. You can't learn to swim by reading a book. You can't learn to ride a bike by reading a book. You've got to actually do it. And it's really, I was talking to one of the secondary schools here recently, and there were 600 year 11, 12, and 13 boys in the room. I was just talking about this program, and I said, before I start saying anything, I'd like to see a show of hands of all those boys who one day think they'd like to run their own business or work for themselves. At least half, probably 75% of the boys put their hands up. We are naturally non-corporate.
People want to work for themselves.
People want to work for themselves. Yeah. And I heard some stats the other day, 53% of the workforce will be freelancers.
Mind you, this is this gig economy that the unions don't like very much.
Yep.
But actually, if we're going to capitalise on this wellspring of creativity, which we've talked about earlier, I suspect we're going to have either one-man or small businesses to allow all that creativity to rise to the top. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely, because corporate cultures killed creativity.
So where New Zealand, let's talk about the direction that we're heading, let's talk about public policy on this.
Yep.
Are we creating an environment where it's going to pour fertiliser on this creativity, or is it going to scotch it?
I believe one of the dangers of democracy is that it breeds bureaucracy, because everyone needs to be a level playing field, so have lots of people policing that, and they tend to muffle it rather than amplify it. And so I think the amplification will come from people breaking rules, and we are natural rule breakers in this country. And there's a little paradox there about, in fact, the thesis I wrote, I called
the paradox.
Paradox, yeah.
What is the paradox?
Well, the paradox is how New Zealand culture enables creativity yet mitigates against its spread. Because,
is that at its core a communication problem by the powers that be, or is it a cultural change that we need to bring about as we bring young people through the education system and send them off on their way of life?
Well, that's the thing, because no one's in charge, and so the kids naturally drift off.
I have to ask you about how you feel about so many young people spending so much time on screens and so much time gaming and things that to me seem not that worthwhile, but maybe I've got it wrong.
Well, gaming now attracts audiences of millions.
Yeah, of course. We saw it on.
And just recently, I mean, and my grandkids now. I look at my iPhone or look at my iPad. They load something new in every time they come to our place, and they're great at Minecraft. I mean, maybe that's the way that brains are going to work. Maybe we'll evolve with huge thumbs. I don't. It's difficult to say, but I reckon that let them go, see what happens, because you can't put toothpaste back in the tube.
That's the way it is. Yeah,
that's the way it is. And the more we try, and there are some things, I mean, you had to put some boundaries around it, but as long as they play sport and as long as they understand their own Brainberg,
yes,
and their Wikipedia or their Mycopedia, and then see it's joining dots. That's the other thing.
You don't see these things as a desensitizer to the creative process.
No. As long as they exercise it in the right way, and as long as they're encouraged to understand that as part of a bigger tapestry.
Well, you're now gone full circle. You're dealing with young minds and helping them grow. Are you seeing the kind of creativity that you saw when perhaps you were their age?
Yeah, well, yes, I do. But the other thing that we do, and it's Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 9, there is no new thing under the sun. And I firmly believe that. Everything's just an adaptation of
what happened before.
Exactly. And my father, the school teacher, was telling me that there's only 10 stories in the world. And I believe that we as humans are hardwired to respond to those stories in both a psychological and physical way. And in retelling stories, and certainly in advertising, I'd always think, is this a quest story, overcoming the monster? See, overcoming the monster story, for example, one of Booker's favourites was Sir George and the Dragon, David and Goliath. There are any number of those. Jaws.
On it goes.
On it goes. And we love those stories.
And they keep coming around every generation, of course.
Of course they do. I mean, nothing's changed.
So, what advice would you give a young person in your position who has a father who says Johnny is interested in law and accounting, but he can write and draw? Today, what would you recommend that Johnny does?
Digital design.
Okay.
If you go to uni and study digital design, you think that half the world's working population, will be self-employed or freelancing in the next 20 years. And the World Economic Forum last year said that these 3 top skills required in the next decade are complex problem solving, critical thinking and creativity.
Well, there you go, you're right in the middle of it.
Nothing to do with tech, nothing to do with... tech may be part of it, but that's the entry fee. Yeah.
Well, Mike, you one of the things you mentioned earlier on is that, it's about thinking. And certainly in this program, you've made us think. And for that, I think New Zealand and we all have to be grateful. So, Mike Hutcheson, thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Well, thanks very much, Campbell. I really enjoyed it. It's been great.